quite a long time ago now. I don't know how many years, I've stopped counting, but quite a long time ago, this passage, John's prologue, as it tends to be called, John chapter 1, was, I think it was the first proper sermon. If you actually think I do proper sermons, that is just a bit presumptuous, isn't it? It was the first of these kind of talks in church that I ever did. And I remember somebody coming up to me after the service and saying, well, Gerard, you did quite well with that, considering it's such a hard passage to start with. Since then, I've preached on it and talked about it a few times since then. I don't know whether I've got any better or not, but I'm not looking for credit afterwards or anything like that. But it is such a deep, complex passage that it is really hard for anybody to talk about, and yet it is so rich and so powerful and so wonderful that it should be such a gift for anybody to be able to actually proclaim the gospel through it, for anybody to be able to give some kind of flavor, some kind of insight about who Jesus is. Because what we have at the beginning of John's gospel is we have John using these mighty, mighty ways to describe Jesus. Yeah, it doesn't start with all of the history stuff. It doesn't start with any other kind of introduction about somebody did this and somebody did that. He gets straight in there to describe Jesus in heavenly terms, connecting Jesus with the whole of heaven and creation. The fact that Jesus is before time and after time and runs through time, and yet became a person in time through the incarnation. He uses this word to describe Jesus as, which is very confusing for us. It comes from the Greek logos, and really, well, it maybe does say that Jesus is the embodiment. He actually sums up in himself God's wisdom and God's powerful message that he has for all of creation. The use of the word also then connects us back to what happens at the beginning of creation, and tells us that Jesus was there at the beginning, and it was through speaking that God creates. The act of creation is done through word. So it has all of these things that kind of link in with that. It is so complicated, and yet it's so good. And then what we have is in verse 14, this phrase, the word became flesh and lived among us. That God becomes one of us. And John also describes Jesus as being life. Just as Jesus calls himself, later on in John's gospel, he calls himself the resurrection and the life. He calls himself the way, the truth, and the life. Yes. Two of us knew. So many different images, so many different things going on just in this beginning part of the gospel. So many themes that John then picks up as he begins to explore who Jesus is and wants to convey. This is the whole point of John's gospel. He tells us that towards the end of his gospel, so that it can be clearly understood who Jesus is, to give us this picture of who he is. So many images. And if you're a classical music kind of a person, or you like opera or anything, then what we have here is something like an overture that you have at the beginning of a musical or an opera, where you have all the different bits of the music that is to come that are there, little tastes of them. Or if you're not into opera and musicals and classical music and things, it's a bit like a trailer for a program. You know those bits, especially if you're watching a series, and then you get to the bit where you're there, your jaw is dropped because there's been some fantastic cliffhanger or something. And then suddenly, before you know it, before you can get to the remote control button because you're so stunned into silence, then they're suddenly telling you everything that's going to happen in the next few weeks. Oh, no, I don't want to see that. And so what John is doing here is giving us this amazing, fantastic trailer, this pre-taste, this preview of what is to come in his gospel. So it's not something that is separate from it. It's something that actually just sets out everything about who Jesus is. But the thing here today that I want to concentrate on is light. Can't deal with everything that's there. That would almost take an eternity. I want us to explore this theme of light. Because in 1 4, in John chapter 1 verse 4, John says, in him was life, him being Jesus, and the life was the light of all people. He is the light of all people. In verse 5, he goes on to say, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. It's a light that cannot be extinguished. Now, there are so many ways, all sorts of woolly, airy-fairy kind of ways that we can look at this concept of light. But I want to narrow it down to looking at two ways that we might find it useful to understand this image of light, where to think of Jesus as being the light. Jesus, who describes himself elsewhere in John's Gospel as being the light of the world. And those two things are this. One is that the light shows us the way. So the first thing is this notion of a light that guides us and shows us the way. Like in Psalms 119, where the writer says, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Now, the writer then was talking about what they understood to be God's word, which was the scriptures that they had already. In particular, it would be about the first 5 books of the Bible. But the idea that it's something that guides us, a light that guides us, like we have street lights that show us the direction that we need to be going in. We have cat's eyes in the road which light up to show us where the route is when we're driving. An aeroplane needs those lights in order to guide them in. And John, in his prologue here in chapter 1, verse 9, says, the true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. So this is the idea of Jesus as the light, as being like the light bulb in our brain, the light bulb in our spirit, the light bulb in our soul, where he helps us to understand things. He helps us to see what is right and what is wrong. He is our guiding light. That Jesus guides us through, navigates for us. If we don't know what to do in life, then we need to turn to what would Jesus do. We need to turn to look to him for direction, to look at the example. There might not be the exact same thing there, but to look at what it is that Jesus has shown us. How would Jesus have dealt with this situation that I am facing here? Jesus is our guiding light. The true light, which enlightens everyone. And the second way that I want us to think about Jesus as being light is as the light that gives hope. The light that gives hope. John says in verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Here we are on December the 15th in the Northern Hemisphere in the United Kingdom. And these are dark times. The time of year means that we're moving towards the shortest day, where lots of us struggle with that and how that affects our mental health, how that affects how we feel. Life just feels more grim. It's great to have some sunshine today, but some days it feels like we don't see the sun. It feels literally darker. And this time of year, as we hurtle, in my case, towards Christmas, feeling kind of out of control as we hurtle towards it in all sorts of ways, Christmas can feel hard. It's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's amazing, it's exciting, it's all of those things. But Christmas, if we're on our own, Christmas if we are facing difficulties in our relationships, or we simply don't have any relationships with other people particularly, can feel like a really dark time. But in other ways, this is a time of darkness that we find ourselves in now, in my opinion. Yesterday, a lot of rain fell. And more rain comes and comes, and our climate feels like something is happening. But like the people at the flood, and unlike Noah, we seem to show a lack of concern, let alone any action on climate change, it would seem. But we don't know where this is taking us. Or all sorts of people are telling us where this is taking us, and yet we don't do anything very much. Dark times. Knives in the hands of so many of our young people. Domestic violence still as prevalent as it ever was, and inevitably when we come to Christmas, finding that there is a traditional spike, an increase in domestic violence. The oppression experienced by so many in our community, in their reliance on drugs and alcohol and gambling. We find hate crime on the increase. We find that racism squirms and hides under rocks, but is still there and still jumps out at us all the time. Still a massive force that divides and rules in our world in so many ways. Loneliness and isolation of so many older people, and lots who are younger too. Dark times. And the darkness is here in the issues that we face in our community in all sorts of ways. In our church, the hostile and exploitative environment of immigration and asylum. The ever-tightening ratchet, the way the fees go up and the hurdles get higher and higher. The heartlessness of universal credit. So many people who are now in debt to the government rather than in debt to loan sharks because of the way that universal credit is hitting so many people. Less and less options on where to get help from for public services. The divide between the well-off and the struggling seeming to widen. The permanence of our food bank here and other food banks too. The hopelessness of so many who access our job club. This is what I see. This is not a party political broadcast getting ready for the next election. This is just my assessment of what sometimes feels like darkness, election or no election. And yet, we have to be people who are the people of and yet. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. In the 80s, I got pretty gloomy. In the 80s, I spent a bit of time out of work. In the 80s, I felt like I was out of sync with all sorts of things that were happening in the world around me. And I got quite down and I got quite angry in the 80s. In the 80s, I think it's the 80s, there was I heard this song the other day and it sounds so dated now. Grandmaster Flash, I think it is. Yeah, The Message. That's right, yeah. And it has this line in it. Don't push me, because I'm close to the edge. Sometimes I wonder how I keep from going under. Sometimes I wonder how I keep from going under. In the 80s, I got quite down. In the 80s, I wasn't a Christian. In the 80s, I didn't know where to turn for help. I didn't know where to turn when the darkness felt like it was overwhelming. I got overcome by the darkness. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't kind of hospitalized, depressed or anything, but it was a dark time for me. And yet, as a Christian, I found some hope. As a Christian, I see that there is something that keeps me from going under. There is something that stops me from falling. And that thing, corny though it might seem, that thing is Jesus. Is having Jesus in my life. At that point in the 80s, I had not invited Jesus into my life. I knew who he was to an extent. I knew about faith. I'd been brought up in a church environment, in a Christian family. But nevertheless, I didn't have that real relationship with him. I didn't see the and yet. I didn't know the and yet. I didn't know that the darkness would not overcome his light. And so as a Christian, I find hope. I find hope in the small things that happen and in the big things that I know. The big things that I know. that God has a purpose for all creation, that goodness will conquer evil, that love will conquer hate, and that these things have been achieved by Jesus Christ on the cross, and that the light cannot be overcome by the darkness, that God is sovereign, that his salvation through Jesus Christ will see us through. I see light and I see hope in the smallest of deeds. I see light and I see hope in conversations that I have. I see light and hope this week alone to think of things that have happened, to hear the stories and to talk with and see the prayers and have the conversations with the children that have come here in this last week has been amazing, and it's been so, and also so inspiring, but also so challenging that we still need to do things to make life better for children. Just in our community alone here in Erdington. And also I've been giving out invitations. I think there are some at the back that you can take. Some invitations for our carol service and for other things. And I've been taking it. I went to all of the shops that are near us along the high street and the businesses. And I went there, and some of those people, I've got to be honest, some of them we've not had a great relationship with. There's one particular person who we had a funeral here one time, and she had a complete meltdown because she couldn't get her car out from the service bay. She gave no truck to the notion that this was a funeral and that it would pass in a moment and that she needed to be respectful. She flipped, okay? And we've never had a good relationship since then. I took one of these cards and invited her to the carol service. She might not come, but she was so chuffed. So, that's really lovely. That's really nice. That's a lovely thing for the church to do. And I had a similar response with some other people along there who we've had similar issues with, some of the tensions of being where we are. And this fills me with hope. And it might seem, if you're feeling a bit burdened by all sorts of things and overwhelmed and overcome, you might think, it's just kind of fiddling around the edges, really, Gerard. This is not really important. But it's in these little things where we find that hope. Yeah? Saint David, the patron saint of Wales, told his followers, who were also followers of Jesus, to be faithful in the small things. Be faithful in the small things. So if we're faithful in the small things, God will bless us in those small things. And those small things begin to add up and make a difference and change lives. We also need to be faithful in the big things and keep our eye on the big plan that God has for all people. And to remember that there is hope. That some goodness is always there. There is nowhere, no situation that is God forsaken. That this place, this life is only temporary. That God's purposes will be fulfilled. That good will come. We have to be patient in this life and the next. But whilst we are waiting and whilst we are being patient, we need to remember about the light that shines in the darkness. And the darkness did not